Alice for joining us. So today's topic would be a century of social justice from Justice Party to the DMK. This week is very, very important in history of Tamil Nadu. Periyar, Arinyar Anna, as well as the first communal GO of the Justice Party were all passed in this week. For example, on 16 September 21, the first Justice Party government passed the first communal government order, GO number 613, thereby first becoming the first electoral body in the history of Indian Legislative Assembly to legitimize reservations. This legislation have since become standard. This GO for the rest of the 100 years played a major role in the upliftment of the downtrodden. To put things in perspective, the manifestos of Justice Party as well as the work of Dravida Kalagam had helped the successive Dravidian parties as well as other similar parties across India in coming up with schemes on upliftment of the poor and the downtrodden. For example, the much acclaimed midday meal scheme was mentioned in the 1927 manifesto of the Justice Party. Similarly, even the industrial policies of the successive DMK governments were borrowed from the manifesto of Justice Party created in 1927. And similarly, if you look at all the programs to uplift women, where from Periyar's thoughts and or from his discussion, the prime example being giving women the equal rights for property was made as a speech by Periyar in the 1930s. Since then, most of the governments, including the Congress, have worked towards the upliftment of the poor, downtrodden, and also to break the barrier of caste. But since 2014, all the progress we have made in upliftment of the downtrodden have been under threat. Most of the schemes that were started by the UPA to help the marginalized have been either rescinded or not enough funds have been allocated. Main example is Manrega. Though the scheme, the Prime Minister himself wanted to cancel, he couldn't do so because it was very popular among the poor, but the funds have been delayed, or there is no clear policies, or number of people getting employment have been reduced. And many such schemes, though even if they were not scrapped, the funds have been reduced. And again, when it comes to affirmative action, RSS has been giving mixed signals. At certain occasions, justify reservation, and certain occasions not, but we know the real intention of the RSS in this. And that is the reason why we have reservation for environmental weaker section, which is directly in contravention to the affirmative action policies as such. And again, another threat for social justice is Modinomics, which is in contrary to any basic macroeconomic policies. So any macroeconomic policies, including Nobel laureates such as Amartya Sen and Abhijit Banerjee have said, for India to come out of this economic recession or self-created stagflation, we'll have to put money in hands of the poor. But since the last 7 years, Modi government's policies have been to put money in hands of the rich. By reducing the corporate taxes by 11 to 12%, we have put money in hands of the rich, and by taxing the fuel, we have taken the money away from hands of the poor. In fact, as per research published by Data Center and The Hindu, Indians spend by far the highest percentage of their income on fuel. For example, 70% on average Indians' income goes on spending for fuel. So again, if you look at the composition of MPs in the Indian Parliament, this Parliament, 2019 Parliament, has the least number of MPs from minority religion, as well as the number of MPs from even OBCs has reduced. The progress has reduced. Even if you look at number of union secretaries, there's just one union secretary who's not from the upper caste, which is again a unique scenario in Indian government. Apart from all this, to have social justice imbibed, you need to have really good institutions. But now every institutions of the country is under threat. There's this amazing book recently published by Christophe Geoffroy, which says Modi's India. By Christophe argues that every institution in India, from the CBI, ED, and institutions such as Supreme Court and Election Commission, which served as an example for the rest of the developing countries, are being deinstitutionalized. Only because of this deinstitutionalization of Supreme Court, for example, is why we are not able to, for example, fight against NEET. NEET exam as such is directly in contravention to tenets of social justice. So if this destruction beyond 2024, it's not sure how the Indian constitution or democracy would be able to survive. Therefore, 2024 would be the most important election in the history of India and its people, and will go down in history as an election that shaped the future of India. With this, I would like to open the floor, and I invite Professor and former MP from Indian National Congress, Dr. Sandeep Dixit, to speak. So you could go on, please.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm sorry, actually, there was some confusion, and I was very, very keen to attend the whole program. I got confused with the dates and all, and therefore, I got this information late. So I had just scheduled another program. So I requested if I could be let off a little early, and the organizers have been very kind to do that. So thank you very much. First of all, Mr. Elangovanji, hello, sir. How are you? He was my very respected colleague when we were in Parliament together, and this is one of those people that used to look up to and look forward to meeting. Manojji, namaskar. We've not been in Parliament together, but honored to be on the same. And Mr. Gandhi also, although I don't know you, but honor and privilege to be with you on screen. And of course, Salim, for you and your colleagues, really thank you. It's rare that we get an opportunity to be with young people. What I will do in my brief intervention is just some things that are immediately striking me as being of extreme importance today, and something that is worrying also. You had mentioned, Dharidaran, in your statement that 2024 could be an extremely important election, because many fear that it will perhaps be the last real democratic election that India may fight. Because once the default, once the controlling institutions, once the basic ideological moorings of public and people change, and change for good, I mean, elections may get fought on principles that are very different from the principles under which all of us believe India is recognized as the kind of nation we recognize India as. And that can be very, very dangerous for what all of us strive at, the kind of India we would like our children and ourselves to grow up in and grow old in. There are some issues that, in fact, I would like to, because it's also a day we are celebrating the great Periyar. And while I've been, from the north, and I've been a staunch congressman, and although I'm personally an atheist, and I don't have much time for caste, but I'm born in a family that in northern India is construed to be from the Brahmin lineage. I have read Periyar, and in spite of all his very colorful language and the very dramatic manner in which that man raised his voice against some of the most, well-entrenched principles of discrimination and exploitation in Indian economic and social society, yet I've had a tremendous admiration for him. So for me personally, it's been a matter of great humility to be part of a small function that is celebrating him and his memory also. Like all men who brought in substantive changes, not only in their time periods, but in many, many years and decades to come, right? Periyar was a person who said things with hitting established and vested interests very, very deeply and directly, sometimes using a language that was colorful, but that was strategic in nature. And that is why people like him have lived beyond their period. But some of the things that he contributed, and to which I personally believe, and I don't think anybody from Tamil Nadu should take it amiss, but somewhere along the line, I feel that some of the principles on which the DK movement, the Dravid movement came up in Tamil Nadu, in the 1930s and 40s, and gradually in the 50s and 60s, it first built itself socially amongst people and politically in confrontation with the Indian National Congress, which was then, of course, the premier party in Tamil Nadu. Then when it builds itself and then it takes over the government, and then Tamil Nadu becomes, politically a battle between the DMK and the kind of slightly more compromised form of the Dravid, which is the Anna DMK. But largely between these two, I thought that it was a tragedy for India that some of the great thought and ideas of Periyar kind of remained restricted to Tamil Nadu and to some of the states in the south because of the peculiar politics in which Tamil Nadu found itself, right? And because the north has, and I know it's a controversial statement to make, but I will still make it. The north has a slightly particular arrogance about its own identity, its own cultural ethos, and especially about its own language, right? While we have learned greatly from many civilizations within northern India, we've learned a lot from the various languages of northern India. We've learned a lot from great thinkers from east, west, also from south, also from all great civilizations across the world. We have somehow not been influenced as much as we should have been from, say, some of the writers like Periyar. And I think in that sense, because North India in a manner dominates the political discourse, at least in terms of some policy, I think we seem to have lost out. And some of the issues that Nalini pointed out in his opening statements and for which we seem to be concerned, maybe would have been tempered and perhaps come out in a different ways if thinkers like Periyar and others would have played a far more prominent role in the thought process and the policy formulations of India. Let me take the first part, and I think in that it's something that it strikes me, which is rationalism. I think in many senses, almost the foundational basis of Periyar's thinking, and on which the Dravid movement was initially formed. The way in which it treated myth and religion, the way in which it treated itself, leadership, ideas, scientific temper. I think these are outstanding, thoughts to have in the early periods of the last century. It is from where, he looked at issues of gender and gender equity, of caste and caste equity, of equality and dignity of people, of equality of livelihoods, etc., and a wide variety. But that is some place where this whole issue of rationalism, while it was one of the foundational principles of independent India in the founding years, we seem to be tottering. In fact, I think India at 70 is much more irrational, perhaps much more steeped in superstition than perhaps the India when it was 5 years old or 10 years old or 15 years old. I mean, a civilization, and when I talk of the Indian civilization, I'm talking of the collective civilization of Indians. There were civilizations in southern India. There were great, very much related, but yet distinct and different. And that's the great beauty of this subcontinent, from the east, from the west, from north, and from parts of the north, from the northwestern areas, from absolute hilly regions of the north. I think the great civilizations, in some sense or the other, always had an adherence and great sages and thinkers in the world of rationalism, of science and technology. But modern India today, I almost fear to use the word modern India in the context of India. It's modern because it's new. Obviously, something that is latest is new, and obviously 2021 in that sense is more new than 2017. But I think in terms of rationalism, our ability to question, ability to look at our own historical legacy, our ability and our guts to look at the good and bad of us as to what we were 2,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, almost all of that is getting lost in this battle of a manufactured past. And I think that's becoming dangerous. And that manufactured past has a very strange and a very dangerous hegemony of some of the identities that seem to be trying to push itself to rule India. And those identities are the identities related with a particular religion, a particular language, or a set of languages that originated somewhere in the northern India. I have nothing like, I basically am a Hindi speaker. I find it, in fact, difficult to express myself in any other language except Hindi. Ilongoman Saab would know most of my speeches in Parliament were also all in Hindi, while I wanted to speak out in English and reach out to all the various people. But I'm on my front foot a Hindi speaker, and I love my language, and I think I'm passionate about it. But I'm not passionate enough to think that's the only language this country has. I think we have the richness of the kind of cultures that is perhaps no other world can touch and imagine. I think Tamil probably has the most outstanding literature, that this nation and its nation's various cultures have ever seen. But when I'm saying the hegemonic tendencies of North India in our language, in our cultural context, is something that is becoming dangerously stuffed upon by all of us. And so the loss of rationalism is not only leading to a temper that is unscientific, it is leading to a decline in questioning ourselves, in this whole element of curiosity, the curiosity for the search for truth. And it is from the search of truth, the issue of questioning, that social change and social justice comes. By its very statement, social justice is a goal you need to achieve. There is hardly any society that has achieved social justice to the full. And you achieve a change when you question. And you achieve a change in questioning something which is embedded in society as a practice, a cultural and a religious norm and belief, only when you seriously question that. And there are people who get out of their safe frontiers are unable to raise questions. They will get brickbats. They will be stoned. They will be killed. They will be maimed. But that is where is a difference between a kingdom or a royalty of the past and the great democracy that India had built. And the reason we went democratic, and the reason why we have a cultural ethos that talks about a unity in diversity, was that it is our institutions, it is our democracy, it is our love and respect for our variety and our diversity that will help us and permit each question and permit each question's logical, constitutional, and just answer. And if the answer is correct, if the answer is constitutional, and if the answer is just, then over time, our institutions, our government, our people, our religious norms, and our cultural ethos will adopt what is just, and somehow or the other finally put to rest what is unjust. But I think it's the opposite of that that is happening. The great changes that we had achieved, at least in theory, in law, in institutional frameworks on democracy, on rights of women, on rights of the downtrodden and the backward, almost all of them are getting questioned today. And the dangerous part, I don't have a problem with a pan-religious identity asserting itself to claim some dignity. Or perhaps if sometimes people may say that it has been pushed back unnecessarily, I don't have a personal problem with that. But I have a serious problem when the issue of identity is actually pushed across to defend vested interests of inequality, injustice, and discrimination. I think the use of a large of the majority religion of India is not the majoritarianism of a religion itself. It is majoritarianism of those who have been hegemonic in that religion. And I think that is the sad part. And that is where the great principles of people like Periyar would also be hurt and hit just as much as many of the other things would be happening. The second thing I think that's getting badly damaged is the issue of equality and equity. India, when I think on the dawn of independence in 1947, and in that, let's be very, very clear, there was hardly any part in India that had not contributed. And here I must say, I think the city from where all of you come, the great city of Chennai, was perhaps one of the greatest battlefronts for the freedom movement. And I think the contribution of the people of Tamil Nadu and Chennai is no less than any other region in this nation. And in fact, Manojji, I'm sure you'll agree with me. We talk of the great freedom fighters from Northern India. When do we ever celebrate the great freedom fighters from Southern India? When the BJP stands up and wants to talk about people who had no role in the freedom movement and wants to celebrate their contributions, they forget the real contributors of people. And that is because in the issue of equity, in the issue of finding out who really an Indian is, because Indian is as diverse as any other form of Indianness. And I think in that sense, we are perhaps the most unique citizenship in the world, because post-industrial revolution and in the post-nation state world, almost all citizenships in the world were defined either around the religion or around the geography or around the language. In India, we defined the citizenship by birth. And I think in that sense, We have contributed greatly to the formation and the idea of the nation state in the world. We don't have a single religion that defines our citizenship. We don't have a single language that defines our citizenship. We don't have a single race that defines our citizenship. We don't have a single belief that defines our citizenship. We don't have a single geography that defines our citizenship. It is birth, and it is an adherence and a commitment and a love of the constitution that we have given to ourselves that really defines us as citizens. In that sense, we've been unique. But it is this, I think, that has hit the current ruling dispensation across India, because not only are they worried about equity, and Rani had pointed out to some extent about the tremendous increase in wealth and income inequality that's happening in India. And that in the last, happening in the last decade or two, but has accelerated to unprecedented extents in the last 6 or 7 years. Even in the COVID period, when almost everybody in India has been hit, every household in India has been hit, it's just a few households and companies that have started expanding. There was a time, Manojji would remember, I think Mr. Gandhi, I'm not sure how to really pronounce your name, Alangovanji would know. There was a time when we used to laugh that Pakistan was owned by 20 families. I think the day is not far away when India will be owned by just 2 families. I mean, I'm sad to say that, right? We'll probably become the shining example and the greatest case study of crony capitalism the world has ever seen. I was always afraid of neoliberalism, but that neoliberalism would lead to something like this. It's something that really disturbs. Anyway, let me get more into the issues of equity. I think what are some of the biggest things that are being hit is first equity on the issue of language. There is today a very, very, very deep-seated, insidious, but planned encroachment into the realm of language. There was a time when somebody who expressed a love for their mother tongue and wanted it to get equal status to any other mother tongue in this country, that voice was heard, respected, given space, and given a constitutional space. Today, that demand has become anti-national. And if demand for the recognition of my mother tongue as my mother tongue is called anti-constitutional, I think it makes a very, very dangerous beginning to change what we construe as the elements of citizenship. And I think that is where I believe, and I earnestly believe, it will people of South India, especially people of Tamil Nadu, who have to rise and reaffirm the fact that the language of India, is it 60 and 70 and 80 and 90 languages. Our commonality is in our ethos. Our commonality is in the way and manner in which we celebrate each other. Our commonality is in the way and manner in which we give equal respect, dignity, love, affection, space, opportunity, jobs, student facilities to each other. The way we treat every Indian as ourselves in spite of our differences. But I think each of our languages is what makes the language of what each Indian talks about. The second is the equality or equity of caste. I think we had made tremendous changes. In spite of the fact that apart from some parts in Western India, some places in Eastern India and most places in Southern India, Northern India did not have the great fortune of tremendous social change movements, especially in the after the Bhakti movement. There was very little of social change movements of a radical large scale. There were some minor ones. They were in Chhattisgarh, they were in parts of Madhya Pradesh, etc. But we had a constitutionally ordained, and starting even from the British period, and we must give them some credit, led by great reformers who were Indians, we started having government mandated and then constitutionally mandated changes that perhaps brought a tremendous change into what I may describe as the most unjust social system in the world, which is the Indian caste system. And I think all of us readily accepted that, even those with tremendous personal adherence to caste started changing. And I can give you an example from my own life. I mean, my grandmother, I remember, and my grandfather used to tell me, he was a freedom fighter, that in the very, very early years, when my grandfather got involved in the freedom movement, people from all communities would come home. And my grandmother was tutored in the traditions of caste, and she would find it difficult to share utensils with others. She would find it difficult to have them coming into the house. But she changed. A woman who was married at the age of 13 into another family. My grandfather was an atheist, but she came from a tremendously religious family, a Brahmin background. She changed, and she changed happily. In my house, in which an egg couldn't come, non-vegetarian was cooked. Muslims would eat. And I'm not saying this because we were any different from any other family that was part of this great social change that was coming in constitutionally and through the efforts of the great freedom fighters that made up this country. That is now today being challenged. Issues of reservation are constantly questioned on this rather odd sense of what is called, what is the word that they use? Merit. Merit itself, I'm not saying merit is not a necessary issue, right? But merit can only be built as a competing principle with competing equal and equity-based people. It's that famous photograph that all of us see. Why do we build a staircase for people who have 2 legs, and why do we build a ramp for people who don't have any legs? That is equity. That is not discriminating against those who have legs. And I think we have come to a case where openly people have started questioning perhaps the world's most affirmative action to bring in social equity and economic equity through the issues of reservation, reservations in education, reservations in jobs. I mean, as some people come to me and say, in reservations in jobs, it's only minor, it's only 5 IAS officers or 10 people in a provincial civil service or 5 people in some other service. That's not the thing. In India, because discrimination was done through your social identity, it is recognizing of certain social identities and their participation in government and in political executive that makes people believe that this country is theirs. What is the difference between a democracy and an autocracy or a dictatorship? It is that we participate in our government. We participate and are equal partners in the decisions of governments that affect my lives. And whether we like it or not, because of the kind of discriminatory society in which we have lived, in which people still look at me first as my caste and then as whatever else I am, it is important that members of those communities who are not even allowed to walk the streets upon which many of us could walk. I mean, for example, the great movement in which Periyar was involved in Kerala in the beginning, on that street in which only Brahmins were allowed to walk. This reservation gives a sense of ownership of the state to people. It is much more than just jobs, and we have to be very, very clear about this. A country has to be owned by people as much as a country believes it owns people. The other thing in which I think equity is completely getting lost is the issue of community and religion. I don't even have to talk about this. I think India was perhaps the most shining example of a secular nation. Today, the word secular itself is becoming an abuse because of people who don't understand what the word secular means. Obviously, in the path of secular governance, there may have been cases in which certain governments have gone one side or the other. That always happens. No government can be completely balanced in their treatment of those who need special treatment, whether it's of minorities or of the backwards or of the poor or of socially discriminated or gender discriminated. But to look at those occasional imbalances, which sometimes the period of that time or the context of that time necessitated, to raise questions about the issue of looking at all human beings and all religions as equal, has become a dangerous rise. The other thing that is now getting hit, and I think in that Periyar was perhaps an outstanding contribution to India's polity, was the issue of gender equity. I think perhaps at a period when we were not even looking at gender equity, Periyar had spoken about gender equity. Look at what's happening with gender equity. And as has often been said, that orthodox women are the biggest danger to women's emancipation. There is a group of women who have been trained in social and religious ethos belonging to a particular political ideology that are constantly challenging whenever women are rising and saying that this nation is as much theirs, their culture is as much this nation's culture as anybody else's. The other point where we are having a constant battle today, and no longer is this issue of equity that we're facing, is the issue of class. Right? We at one time celebrated people of every community, every livelihood. We're not happening that anymore. We are only celebrating those who are rich, and it doesn't matter to us how they achieve their wealth. I celebrate people who achieved wealth, who created wealth. I laud industrialists who create jobs, because it is industrialists who will create jobs, who will create wealth. But if they become industrialists and if they've got their industrial empires on an equal footing of equal opportunity and equal competition, not the kind of crony capitalism and neoliberal economics that we've had in the past 8 to 10 years. And that is what is sad. I don't want to continue much more from here because I think I've given you my sense of the areas and the fissures in which great challenges are going to come to this country. But the question that was asked is, how will creation of social justice, how do we actually ensure that? I think the most important thing in many senses, and that is why I'm going to address all the people here, all my brothers and sisters who are from South here, is you raised your voices against most of these injustices in the 50s and 60s. You spoke about equity of language. You spoke about equity of race, religion, gender equality. You brought in elements of pro-poor policies that are outstanding. That is why Tamil Nadu today is one of the foremost states in all human development parameters, and many of the other states of southern India. Since we are talking in the context of the Dravid movement, I'm talking more of Tamil Nadu. But the remarkable achievements that Andhra Pradesh has done, or Kerala has done, or Karnataka has done, I mean, these are not achievements that can be washed away or wished away. In spite of the fact that we have the same bureaucracy, we have the same set of laws, we have the same social discrimination at a given point of time. I think you need to come back and reiterate the forms in which social justice is necessary. We have to bring back rational thinking. We have to bring back a scientific temper, at least in our policies and in our treatment of people, and in giving space and dignity to people in their culture, their way of life, and what they want to live in. We have to bring back the issue of the fact that women are equal, not because they act like men. I mean, some of the things, Ilangovanji, that really disturbs me is that we celebrate the rise of the Indian woman if she's become a pilot. When many ads we see, we celebrate that Indian woman has, come to time because she's now joining the armed forces. Why is it that we only celebrate a woman when she's taken on the roles of men? Why is the woman as a mother not celebrated? What is wrong if a woman wants to remain as a housewife? What is wrong if she cleans somebody's house? How is cleaning somebody's house any less of being a human being as taking on any activity that was till now forcefully controlled by men? Why is a policewoman such? And I have great respect for women who go into the armed forces. Tremendous, and I salute them. But what I'm saying is, we cannot say that the women have come into their own because they can now do what till yesterday we only allowed men to do. It's not that they have achieved something tremendous. They could always achieve something tremendous. It is people like us who had brought these false barriers in front of them. So one is, we have to come back and give equal access to gender. And lastly, and last of all, we have to bring in principles of equity into our economics. Our taxation systems have to change. Dhanidharan, you had pointed a little bit towards the fact that our tax rates have become very, very low. Not only have the tax rates become low, governments are constantly working on giving tremendous leverage and leverage to industrial companies as and when it happens. I'm all for protecting industry. I'm not for protecting industrialists. If industries are in trouble, when the economy goes down, we must protect them. We must give them tax breaks. If you want industries to come up in hitherto backward areas, please give tax breaks. Please put up industrial estates and give land much cheaper than in other areas. But you cannot distort competition. Where are the great laws that used to be antitrust and anti-monopoly in India? America does not allow cross-media ownership, and we allow cross-media ownership. The Times of India owns a newspaper, the Times of India owns a news channel, the Times of India owns a radio. In the United States of America, which is the beacon of neoliberalism in the world, you're not allowed to do that. Anti-monopolistic practices, a Reliance or an Adani could not have come up in the United States. This kind of monopolistic practices could not even happen there. And we are going to do an even worse thing. These people who have in any case created all their industries and empires on other people's money are going to start owning our banks also. I put money into the State Bank of India because I had trust in the state of India, not in the State Bank of India. And if the State Bank of India goes away, my trust is sold off for the benefit of somebody else. So it's equity in economics, and it's rechanging our laws to ensure that wealth and income laws are more towards distributive justice than towards accumulation and exploitation by a few. I'm sorry, I think I've overshot my time. I promised Archana, one of the people who are organizing this, that I won't speak more than 20-25 minutes, but I'm sorry I took a little bit of time. All us politicians have a problem of speaking too much. So sorry for that. But Ilangovanji, once again, really, really glad to see you. It's so nice to see you. And Manojji, it's been an honor for me to be, I've heard you so much in Parliament. You are amongst the few people who has the guts to say things that need to be said. And to Gadhiji, hopefully I'll come to know you better in coming time. Dharni, thanks a lot for calling me here. My parents-in-law live in Chennai, so I'm a half Madrasi. So maybe someday when I come there, I'll take the benefit of meeting all of you. Archana, once again, thanks for getting me in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, thank you so much for your amazing speech. And I think in fact, I should have apologized to all of you for kind of confirming the event pretty very late, because we also wanted to bring a couple more people in, and then their schedules were not working out. Normally it's not this happens at all, but so it's I have to apologize. And I think you also made a very valid point when you spoke about merit. In fact, last week I wrote an article saying merit as a concept is utopian and an illusion, because, for example, you can't compare a kid living in Barakamba Road and attending modern school and probably a kid somewhere in a rural village in Farrukhabad. Like the kid who's born in the Lutines, Delhi, definitely have amazing, like 10 times or 20 times more advantages. In fact, the study they published also mentioned a stat from the College Board in which it said, if you're born to the top 1% family in the US, you're 77 times more likely to attend an Ivy League university, for simple reason that they have higher SAT scores, and SAT or NEET-like exams are trainable. And second thing, the tremendous progress which India attained is education. I think two parties that contributed to it was Indian National Congress and I think the precursor of DMK, the Dravidian movement. If Indian National Congress focused on quality of education, like setting up of IITs, Justice Party and the DK focused on making it more inclusive. Tell me one developing country that can boast of institutions like IITs or IIMs. IITs, for example, are rated as one of the best undergrad universities on par with the MITs. So I think this is, and also Jawaharlal Nehru University, right? So I think if BJP government can't create, I think they should not destroy these universities by bringing some unqualified people to head the JNU, or by reducing the funds given to IITs, and so on and so forth.
They are not destroying institutions like JNU or institutions like Delhi University. They're destroying what its students can ask and do. They're not scared of a university. They're scared of what kind of curiosity, ability to question, and the rationality that these universities generate. They don't mind any university. They don't mind at all. Hello, Archana. Manojji, I'm blessed. Archana was one of my finest students. I have a small role as a professor also.
Great.
So,
that part I didn't know.
Yeah. Why do you think I'm here? It's all
that is news to me also. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. It was great listening to you after a long time.
Thank you. So,
sir, could we have some questions? Maybe I'm aware that you wanted to leave. So
no. I have some time. I have about 10 minutes. No problem.
So I will have the privilege of going for the first question. So my question is, it's kind of also tricky for you. So right now, so we to contest against Modi in 2024, we need a really strong opposition, and a very strong opposition. We need International Congress. Any alliance, the opposition alliance to Modi, will have to be pivoted around the INC. There is no possibility for a third front. It's very clear. The history says it. So in such a scenario, do you think Congress is ready? Does Congress have its house in order? If not, what do you think are the steps the party have to take?
Okay, I'll ask and I'll answer as honestly as possible. In any case, I'm on the margins of my own party, so I'll probably get further marginalized, but that doesn't matter. I think when people look for an alternative, okay, because we are increasingly coming to the post-ideological world, just as we are in a post-truth world, we're in a post-ideological world. And actually, we are not really in a post-ideological world. Neoliberalism as a social and economic ideology has actually won the battle, and therefore they want it to become a non-ideological world, because they don't want the debate on ideology or the battle on ideology to enter the realm of politics. So it will be one kind of social and economic right-wingers fighting another set. But so apart from parties, people also look at leadership. Okay. So while the Congress is strong and the regional parties are strong in their states, okay, we also need to project at the national level, and I'm here not putting one person versus another, right? Who is willing to come out and say that I have ideas to lead this nation, right? I have an ability to connect with you, and I have an ability to respond to you and your issues. And it's not difficult for any leader to do that. People are educated. There are people in our party who've had a tremendous family history of having ruled this nation, who've had tremendous support. But people don't want reluctant leaders. Okay, you can have a reluctance in the exercise of power. You can have a reluctance when you want to be personally ambitious or not. You cannot be reluctant in having an ambitious for the ideology you want to lead. Okay, so all I'm saying is, when we want to set our house in order, right, our leaders need to set their houses in order. Right? Let's take the example of Tamil Nadu. Okay, there is a gentleman who led the DMK to victory. Now, in Stalin, I met him once when we had gone together to Patna for the swearing in of Nitish Kumar when he had won along with Laluji last time. I spent, I think, about 2 hours with him on the airport. Mr. Balu was there. So I was talking to Mr. Stalin through Mr. Balu because we didn't share any language that both of us commonly understood. But even at that point of time when I was talking to him, I could see that there was a fire in that gentleman. Okay. Of course, as I said, the strength of a man's ability to speak does not come when there is a translator, but because I had a very good equation with Mr. Balu, I was chatting with him, and I could see that here was a man who wanted to do something good. And if wanting to do something is an ambition linked with how you want to do something good, which is capture of power, I think that's an unbeatable combination. So Congress has to decide whether what we want for the nation, we want to do it through ourselves, through our leaders, in the manner in which we want to do, and in the manner in which this constitution gives us space, which is winning this election. Once we decide that, I know that there are parties like the DMK and others who in the current phase know that a grand alliance of all of us, perhaps the way it was in 2004, give or take a few more and a few less. I mean, no one alliance is the same as the previous alliance. If that comes through, Modi is going to get a run for his money. You see, we have tremendous local leaders today who have gone beyond their state as an imagery, right? Mamta is a tremendous example of that. The chief minister of Maharashtra, although he came from a very different background, while running the government has started showing very different signs of policy priorities. So we have in the opposition today, I'm sure Mr. Stalin, given a little more time, and if he really, goes the way I've always thought DMK governments will go, I think we'll have another tremendous leader in southern India. So we have a leader in the west, we have a leader in south, we have a leader in east, we need a leader in the north, and the Congress is in a unique opportunity to provide that leadership.